My name is Bridget Calloway. I am 31 years old. 2 months ago, my husband drove me out to a remote lake in northern Minnesota, told me to walk to the water's edge to take a picture, and then hit me from behind and left me there to drown. But I didn't drown. And last week, I walked back into my own house to find something that broke me in a way the cold water never could. I want to start from the beginning because none of this makes sense unless you understand what I thought my life was. I grew up in a small town outside of Indianapolis. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic. My parents were together, we had dinner at the table most nights, and I got decent grades and went to a state school for nursing. I was the kind of person who returned shopping carts, who remembered coworkers' birthdays, who genuinely believed that if you were good to people, they would be good back. Maybe that sounds naive. Looking back now, I think it was. But at the time, it was just how I moved through the world. I met my husband at a friend's birthday party when I was 26. He was funny and confident, the kind of person who makes everyone in the room feel like they're the only one he's talking to. He had this way of listening, really listening, tilting his head slightly, holding eye contact, making you feel like every word out of your mouth actually mattered. I fell for it completely. I think most people would have. We dated for 1.5 years. He was attentive, patient, never once raised his voice. When I had a rough shift at the hospital, he'd have dinner ready. When my car broke down on the highway, he drove 40 minutes in the rain to wait with me for the tow truck. He showed up. Consistently, reliably, he showed up. And when he asked me to marry him in a little restaurant in Chicago with a ring I later learned he'd saved up for quietly over 8 months, I cried. Actual tears. Because I thought this was it. I thought I had done something right. We got married in October. Just over 100 people, a venue outside the city with those string lights everyone was doing, burnt orange flowers because it was fall, and I've always loved fall. My best friend from nursing school was my maid of honor. My dad danced with me to a song I'd loved since I was 12. Everything was exactly what I'd pictured. 3 weeks later, he suggested a late anniversary trip. Something small before the colder weather really settled in. A cabin by a lake up north, just the two of us, quiet and remote. He said he wanted us to have something just for ourselves before life got busy again. I thought it sounded perfect. The first day was fine. We cooked together, took a long walk along the shore, sat by the fire. Normal. Good, even. But somewhere around the second day, I started noticing something I couldn't quite name. He was present, but not really there. Laughing at the right moments, but a half second off. Like he was watching a show he'd already seen and knew where the jokes were coming. When I reached for his hand across the dinner table, he let me hold it, but didn't squeeze back. I told myself I was being too sensitive, newlywed nerves or whatever. We'd been together 2 years. Of course, the electric feeling had calmed down a little. That was normal. That was healthy even. So I pushed the feeling down and told myself to stop looking for problems. On the third morning, he woke up in a good mood. Unusually good. He made coffee, suggested we walk down to the far end of the lake where he'd seen a spot with a better view of the tree line. He said the light was supposed to be incredible in the morning. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the man I married. He's back. I grabbed my jacket and followed him. The walk was about 20 minutes. We didn't talk much, but it didn't feel uncomfortable, just quiet. The kind of quiet that happens in the woods when there's nothing pressing to say. The view really was beautiful. The trees had lost most of their color by then, but a few were still holding on, and the water was perfectly still and gray. He said, "Go stand by the edge. I'll take a picture on your phone." I walked toward the water. The ground was uneven, soft near the bank. I was looking out at the lake, smiling a little, thinking about nothing in particular. And then something hit the back of my head. I don't remember falling. I remember the cold. The water was so cold it felt like being struck again, all at once, everywhere. I remember trying to find the surface and not knowing which direction it was. I remember the sound or the absence of sound, that thick underwater silence where everything outside stops mattering. And then I remember getting my face above the water, gasping, my whole body seizing from the cold, and turning back toward the bank. He was standing there watching me. He didn't move. He didn't call out. He just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, watching me struggle. And then he turned around and walked back into the trees. I want you to understand how cold that water was. October in northern Minnesota. I was fully dressed. My jacket was soaked through within seconds, dragging me down. My boots were full of water. My hands stopped working. I couldn't feel my fingers well enough to grip anything. I was screaming, but I don't think much sound came out because my lungs were so tight from the cold they wouldn't cooperate. Somehow, and I still don't entirely understand how, I got to a shallow section further along the bank where some fallen branches were close enough that I could grab on. I pulled myself out. I collapsed on the mud and just lay there, shaking so hard my teeth were cracking against each other. I couldn't think. There was no coherent thought. Just cold and shock and the sound of water dripping off my clothes. I don't know how long I was there. At some point, I heard voices. 2 hikers on a trail I hadn't known was nearby. A couple, maybe in their 50s, with real hiking gear and a small dog. The woman saw me first. She started running before her husband did. They didn't ask many questions. They wrapped me in everything they had. A fleece, a windbreaker, a foil emergency blanket they had in their pack. The man called 911. The woman held me and said my name over and over, even though I hadn't told her my name yet, just quietly saying, hey, stay with me, you're okay. You're like she'd done this before, or had always been exactly the kind of person who would know what to do. I was taken to a hospital about 40 minutes away. Hypothermia, a concussion, a deep bruise along the back of my skull consistent with blunt force trauma. The sheriff's deputy who came to take my statement was a woman who listened to everything I said and wrote it all down without making me feel like I was overreacting or imagining things. She told me they would look into it. She told me to rest. Here's the part that I have had to explain to people and that I know some of you won't fully understand. I did not call my family. Not right away. Not for weeks. I know how that sounds. I know it looks like a gap in the story, and I know from experience that people's first reaction is to ask why, as if the answer should be simple. So let me try to explain it the way it actually felt. I was in a hospital in a town where I knew no one. My husband had just tried to kill me. Not a person I vaguely knew, not someone I'd been warned about. The man who had driven me to get coffee at 6 in the morning when I had early shifts, who had learned how to make my mom's cornbread recipe from scratch because he wanted to impress her at Thanksgiving, who had slow danced with me at our own wedding to a song I'd picked. That person had stood on a bank in the cold and watched me drown without moving a single muscle to help me. When something that big breaks apart, you don't immediately know how to talk about it. You don't know who to call, because you don't yet know what you're going to say. You can't say it out loud because saying it out loud means it's real. And for a little while, even just a few days, you need it not to be real yet. And there was something else. The deputy had warned me that without a witness to the initial act, cases like this could be complicated. My husband could say I slipped. He could say he panicked and froze. He could say I was confused from the concussion. I had been through enough to know that scared and angry wasn't the same as protected. I needed to be protected before I announced that I was alive. The hospital connected me with a social worker who helped me find a short-term place to stay through a local assistance program. It was a small room in a house run by a woman named me. Arsenal. No, wait, I can't use that name. A woman who ran a kind of informal safe haven for people who needed to disappear for a little while. She asked almost nothing. She made soup. She was the kind of quiet that felt like a choice rather than an absence. The deputy stayed in contact with me. She was building a case. She told me to be patient. Weeks passed. My ribs healed. The headaches faded. I started sleeping without waking up in a cold sweat at every small noise. I called the hospital where I worked and gave them a vague medical leave story. I didn't tell them the truth. I couldn't. I was still figuring out what the truth was going to cost me. I spoke to a lawyer over the phone, a woman who specialized in domestic violence cases, who explained what evidence would be useful, what the timeline looked like, what I could expect. She was practical and direct and didn't soften anything, which was exactly what I needed. She said, "Don't go home until you have something." And I didn't. Every night for those weeks, I thought about him. Not with longing. I want to be clear about that. I thought about him the way you think about a problem you haven't solved yet. I kept going back over every moment I'd missed, everything that had seemed small at the time and now felt like a blinking signal I'd just been too happy to read. The half-second delays. The hand that didn't squeeze back. The trip he'd suggested. The remote cabin. The walk to the far end of the lake where no one would be. All of it had been a plan. A patient, careful plan. And I had walked right into it in my fall jacket, thinking about how pretty the trees were. That was the part that took the longest to sit with. Not the anger, not the grief, the embarrassment. The specific sting of having been that trusting, that available, that certain that I was loved. But here's the thing about time. It clarifies. It removes the noise and leaves you with just what's real. And what was real was that I was alive. Whatever he had planned, I was alive, and I was going to use that. 2 months after the lake, the deputy called me. She had spoken with the county DA. They had pulled phone records showing a series of calls and texts between my husband and someone I had not expected. They had financial documents. They had enough to move forward. She said I could come home. I drove back to Minneapolis on a Thursday afternoon. I hadn't told anyone I was coming. I parked a street over from our house and sat in the car for a long time, watching the light in the front window. My heart was doing something I couldn't fully control. I had thought about this moment for weeks and had imagined feeling angry or strong or ready. Mostly I just felt very tired. I walked to the front door. I could hear voices inside, more than one. Music, the kind of music you put on when you're celebrating something. I used my key. The living room was full of people. People I knew, our friends, some of my coworkers from the hospital, neighbors from our street. There were flowers everywhere, white and cream, the kind that show up at weddings or showers. Someone had set out a table with food. There were little paper signs strung across the archway between the living room and the dining room. They said congratulations. My husband was standing in the center of the room in a dress shirt I'd bought him last Christmas. And next to him, wearing a white dress, holding a small bouquet, was my sister. I have a younger sister. She's 4 years younger than me. We shared a room until I left for college. I taught her to drive in an empty church parking lot on Sunday mornings. I was the one who held her hair back the first time she ever drank too much at a friend's party at 17. I was the first person she called when she got into her graduate program. I was there for every big thing in her life, every hard thing. And she had been at my wedding 4 months ago, standing in the third row in a dusty rose dress, crying when I said my vows. She was in my living room in a white dress, standing next to my husband who had tried to kill me. The room hadn't noticed me yet. For a few seconds, I just stood there in the doorway, still in my coat, looking at the two of them laughing at something someone had just said. The sound felt very far away. Then someone turned and saw me. The first sound was a woman's gasp, one of my coworkers, then another. The music kept playing for a few seconds before someone thought to turn it off. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I have ever heard. My husband's face drained of color so fast it looked like a trick. My sister's hand went to her mouth. Someone in the back of the room said, "Is that?" and didn't finish the sentence. I walked in. I didn't run. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I had spent 2 months getting to this moment, and I was not going to fall apart in front of all these people who loved me. I walked across the room until I was standing about 6 feet from both of them. I looked at him first. I said, "I remember everything." I said it quietly because quiet is scarier than loud. He said my name. Just my name. Like that was a sentence. "I remember the lake," I said. "I remember the walk. I remember you watching me in the water and putting your hands in your pockets and walking back to the cabin. The room was completely still. He said, "I don't know what you're talking about," his voice doing that thing where it's trying to be steady and you can hear exactly how hard it's working. He said you had an accident. You were confused. You had a head injury. Someone in the room said, "Wait." That's when my mother stepped forward from somewhere behind me. I hadn't seen her. She had known I was coming. She had been the one person I had called in those 2 months, in the 6th week, when I finally couldn't carry it alone anymore. She had cried for 40 minutes and then gotten very, very quiet and said, "Okay, tell me everything." She had spent 6 weeks of her own doing what she could from the inside, staying close to my husband, being the grieving mother-in-law, listening. She'd noticed the same thing I'd noticed in those first weeks after my disappearance. Not enough grief, the kind of sad that gets performed in public and then turns off the moment the audience leaves. She'd heard a phone call she wasn't supposed to hear. She'd seen a text she wasn't supposed to see. She had taken careful notes and shared everything with the deputy. She walked to the center of the room and she said, "I think everyone here deserves to know the truth." She had printed out the documents. She had screenshots. She had a timeline laid out carefully that showed a financial motive that went back nearly 8 months before our wedding. My husband had a significant amount of debt I had never known about. Debt connected to a failed business venture he had told no one about, and I had a trust fund from my grandfather that transferred fully to a spouse after 2 years of marriage or upon death. Our 2-year mark would have been in December. There was a plan to report me as having gone missing on the trip, eventually presumed drowned, the lake being deep and remote enough that a body might never surface. He would have inherited everything by spring. My sister had known. She had been involved. She had agreed to it, whether from love or fear or greed. I still don't fully know, and maybe never will, but she had agreed to it. She had helped him plan it. She had been the reason he'd suggested that particular lake, because she had gone to summer camp in that area as a child and had told him once how deep the water was. I heard this the same time everyone else in that room heard it. I want you to understand that. I had known the shape of it, but not all the detail. Standing there in my own living room, surrounded by the people who had shown up to celebrate my husband and my sister's engagement, I heard the rest of the story for the first time. The sheriff's deputies came through the front door about 4 minutes later. The timing had been planned. They had been outside. 2 officers. They had a warrant. My husband didn't fight it. I think he'd understood the moment I walked through the door that it was over. He looked at me once, right before they put him in handcuffs, and I looked back. I didn't say anything. There was nothing I wanted him to have. My sister looked at me from across the room, and I watched her face go through about 7 different things in about 3 seconds. She started to say my name. I shook my head. Not because I'll never speak to her again. I genuinely don't know the answer to that yet, but because there was nothing in that moment she had a right to explain. The room emptied slowly. People stayed to hug me, to cry, to say they couldn't believe it, to say they were so sorry, to say they'd had no idea. I stood in the middle of all of it and let it happen. When everyone was gone, it was just my mother and me in the living room with all the flowers and the food and the paper congratulations signs still hanging in the doorway. She didn't say anything for a while. We just stood there. Then she crossed the room and put her arms around me, and I let myself cry for the first time since the lake. Not angry crying, not the ugly, desperate kind, just the release of something that had been held too tightly for too long. The sound of something finally being allowed to be over. I don't know what the next year looks like. There will be a trial, or trials, more likely. There will be depositions and attorneys and days I don't want to get out of bed. My sister is facing charges. My husband is in custody. My grandfather's trust is now tied up in legal proceedings. I am temporarily back in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house at 31 with a duffel bag and a box of things I grabbed from the house before I left again. But I am alive. I keep coming back to that because it sounds simple, but it isn't. He had a plan. He had a specific lake. A specific time of year when the water would be cold enough, a specific trail that was remote enough that no one should have been nearby. He had thought about it. He had chosen me, married me, spent 2 years building trust that would make me walk right to the edge without suspecting anything, and then he had tried to end me because of my grandfather's money. But the hikers had been there. The dog had needed a walk. The trail had been listed on a site neither of us had ever heard of, and I had gotten to a fallen branch that had been there in that exact spot for some number of years before I ever needed it. Sometimes things happen exactly as they were planned, and sometimes they don't, and when they don't, you find out who you are in the space that opens up. I know who I am now. That's not nothing. That's everything. There's a fallen branch at the edge of a lake in northern Minnesota that I will never be able to find again. I've thought about going back to look for it, but I think part of me knows it doesn't matter, because the branch was never really the point. The point is that I was standing in my own living room 2 months after someone tried to end my life, and I was still standing. That's the part I keep returning to. Not the anger, not the legal proceedings, not even the grief of losing my sister in a way that feels permanent even though she's physically still alive. Just the standing, the fact of it. I've had a lot of time to think about what actually happened, and I don't mean the lake. I mean the years before the lake. The slow, patient way I handed over my trust to someone who had decided very early on exactly what I was worth to him and nothing more. I was worth a grandfather's trust fund and a clean paper trail. That was the whole calculation. And I walked into it because I was good at believing people, because I had never really been given a reason not to be. I don't think that goodness was wrong. I've sat with that question long enough to feel settled about it. The failure wasn't mine, but there is something I understand now that I didn't understand before, which is that being a decent person is not the same as being a careful one. I was decent. I was not careful. And the two things need to live together if you're going to move through the world without getting destroyed by it. My mother was careful. She noticed things I missed because she was watching differently than I was. She saw the grief that turned off too quickly, the sadness that existed only in front of an audience. She placed a recorder. She kept notes. She did all of it quietly, alone, without telling anyone, because she had understood something I was still learning, that knowing the truth and being able to prove the truth are two completely different things, and only one of them protects you. That is a kind of intelligence I want to carry with me for the rest of my life. Not suspicion, not cynicism. Just the clear-eyed willingness to look at what's actually in front of you instead of what you want to be there. And then there is the matter of the 2 months. I will not pretend those weeks were anything other than what they were. There were nights in that small room when I could not stop shaking, not from cold, just from the weight of it. There were mornings I had to talk myself into getting up by listing the very small, very concrete reasons why it mattered. Shower. Eat. Call the lawyer. One thing, then the next. That's all resilience actually is, I think. It's not a feeling. It's a decision you make in the absence of any feeling at all, when the only reason to keep moving is that stopping is the other option and you refuse to give anyone that. I kept moving. My mother kept watching. The deputy kept building. And the branch was there when I needed it. None of us are guaranteed that the branch will be there. But I think about the kind of person who has enough left in her after a concussion and hypothermia and a heart that had just been broken in the most complete way imaginable to reach for it anyway. That person existed inside me before I knew she was there. She'll be there from now on, and I'll know it. That's not a small thing to walk away with.